9 years, 2 kids, 1 dead wife's memory, and a 15-minute meeting just took it all away, gal. But they had no idea what he'd build from the wreckage. He lost the house, he lost the title, but he refused to lose the one thing they couldn't take, being the floor his kids could still stand on. Everyone told him he had nothing left to risk. He looked at this broken building and saw the only thing he had left to build. 1 year after losing everything, this single dad built something no spreadsheet ever saw coming. But his story wasn't finished yet.
If you have ever felt like the whole world collapsed on you at once, stay with me until the end. Because what this single father built out of nothing will remind you that losing everything is sometimes the only way to find what actually matters. Before we go any further, hit that like button and subscribe, because you will not want to miss how this story ends. Marcus Hale sat in his car in an empty parking garage, both hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at a termination letter folded into a tight, angry square on the passenger seat. 9 years at Sterling & Co. Foods. 9 years of missed dinners and late nights, and promises to his kids that he would make it. Up to them someday. Gone in a 15-minute meeting with a man who barely looked up from his laptop. Jonathan Sterling had built his reputation on a single ruthless phrase, repeated in every leadership seminar he ever gave. Sentiment is not a strategy. He had used that exact phrase the day he fired Marcus, as though 9 years of a man's life could be filed away under sentiment and dismissed. Marcus had known layoffs were coming. What he had not expected was to be first on the list. Despite running the most efficient distribution division in the company, despite training half the warehouse managers now technically outranking him, he would later learn, though it offered little comfort, that his salary had simply crossed a threshold some algorithm on the 40th floor had flagged as reducible. He was 41 years old, a widower raising 2 children alone, and to Sterling & Co. Foods he had become in the end. Nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet that no longer made financial sense. His wife Claire had died 2 years earlier, a fast and merciless cancer that had taken 11 months from diagnosis to funeral, leaving Marcus alone to raise Eli, 12, and Mia, 7. He had held the family together through grief, with the only tool he trusted completely: routine. Wake up, make lunches, go to work, come home, help with homework, tuck them in, repeat. The job had been the one stable pillar left standing after Claire's death. The thing that let him tell his children, even through his own private devastation, that everything was going to be okay. Now that pillar was gone too, and Marcus did not know how to explain that to 2 children who had already lost more than any child should. Marcus still kept Claire's handwriting taped inside a kitchen cabinet, a scrap of paper listing her grandmother's dinner roll recipe in looping cursive, the ink slightly smudged from years of flour-dusted fingers touching it before every holiday. She had always been the one who wanted to open a small shop someday, joking that Marcus's steady, corporate paycheck was the only thing standing between her and a life covered in flour instead of spreadsheets. In the darkest weeks after the firing, that old joke had returned to him uninvited, equal parts comfort and torment, a reminder of a version of their future that illness had quietly erased before either of them had the chance to choose it on their own terms. The months after the firing unraveled quickly and mercilessly. Severance ran out faster than Marcus had budgeted, eaten by mortgage payments, medical bills still lingering from Claire's illness, and the quiet expenses of raising 2 grieving children. Interviews came rarely and led nowhere. At 41, with a title that no longer meant anything outside Sterling & Co. Internal hierarchy, Marcus found himself competing against candidates a decade younger, for jobs a decade smaller than the one he'd lost. 6 months after the firing, the bank sent a foreclosure notice. Marcus stood in the kitchen where Claire used to hum while making pancakes and read the letter twice before he let himself cry, quietly, so Eli and Mia would not hear him through the walls. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the hum of industrial dryers a constant backdrop to homework and bedtime stories. Eli, old enough to understand what losing the house meant, grew quiet and withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room instead of talking to his father the way he used to. Mia, younger and less able to name what she felt, began asking every night whether they would have to move again, whether Daddy would lose this home too. Marcus answered every time with more confidence than he actually possessed. Because a father's first job, he had decided, was to be the floor that never gave way, even when it was cracking beneath his own feet. It was Ruth Alvarez who first pulled him back from the edge of despair. Ruth was 78 years old, a widow herself, who lived 2 doors down from the laundromat apartment and had once run a small neighborhood bakery for over 40 years before her hands grew too unsteady to knead dough professionally. She noticed Marcus sitting alone on the building's back steps one evening, staring at nothing, and instead of offering empty sympathy, she handed him a warm loaf of bread wrapped in a dish towel and said simply, "Eat something." Grief makes fools of people who forget to eat. That small act of practical kindness became, over the following weeks, something much larger. Ruth began inviting Marcus and the kids up to her apartment on Sunday afternoons, where the smell of baking bread filled rooms that had not felt like a home to anyone in years. She taught Eli how to shape dinner rolls, praising his careful hands, coaxing him slowly out of his silence one shaped loaf at a time. She let Mia lick frosting from mixing spoons and told her stories about her own late husband, a baker who had immigrated with nothing but a family sourdough starter and a stubborn belief that bread could rebuild a life. For Marcus, those Sunday afternoons became the first hours in over a year where the weight on his chest loosened even slightly. One Sunday, kneading dough at Ruth's counter, Marcus mentioned, almost as a joke, that the old abandoned bakery on Larkspur Street, boarded up for nearly 3 years since its previous owner retired without finding a buyer, reminded him of Ruth's old shop from the photographs on her wall. Ruth did not laugh. She set down her rolling pin and looked at him with an intensity that startled him. "That building has good bones," she said. "It's been waiting for someone who actually needs it, not someone who just wants it." Marcus dismissed the idea immediately. He had no capital, no credit anyone would extend, nothing left to risk. But the idea, once spoken aloud, refused to leave him alone. The unexpected turn came through Claire's Aunt Dorothy, a distant relative Marcus had met only a handful of times at family gatherings, who passed away that winter and left Marcus a modest inheritance, just enough, combined with what remained of his savings, to make a desperate offer on the Larkspur Street building. The bank that owned the foreclosed property, eager to unload a long vacant commercial lot, accepted a low-ball bid from a man with almost nothing left to lose. Marcus signed the papers with hands that would not stop shaking, uncertain whether he had just made the smartest decision of his life, or the final mistake that would finish what Sterling & Co. Foods had started. The building itself was in far worse condition than Marcus had let himself imagine. A collapsed section of ceiling in the back kitchen, ancient wiring that no inspector would approve, decades of grime coating every surface. His old friend Carlos Diaz, a contractor Marcus had known since high school, took one look at the place and let out a low whistle before rolling up his sleeves anyway. "You're crazy," Carlos told him, hauling out a shattered section of drywall. "But I've never seen you fight for anything the way you're fighting for this." Carlos worked most weekends for months at a steeply discounted rate, sometimes for nothing but dinner and the promise of free bread for life, because he believed, the way Ruth believed, that this rebuild was about far more than a business. Eli's transformation surprised everyone most of all. The same boy who had gone silent after losing the house began showing up at the construction site every afternoon after school, first just to watch, then to help sand cabinet doors and haul debris, slowly finding his voice again amid sawdust and paint fumes. Mia, meanwhile, appointed herself the bakery's unofficial name consultant, rejecting a dozen of her father's suggestions before finally approving the Larkspur loaf, a name Marcus painted onto a hand-carved wooden sign himself, working late into the night while his children slept upstairs in the small apartment above the shop that would become their new home. The lowest point of the renovation came on a February night when a burst pipe flooded the half-finished kitchen just hours after Mia had spiked a sudden fever, leaving Marcus torn between mopping ankle-deep water off a floor Carlos had just finished leveling and holding his daughter through a restless, feverish night in their small apartment upstairs. He chose Mia without hesitation, of course, sitting beside her bed until dawn, while water seeped quietly into subflooring below. And when Carlos arrived the next morning to find the damage, Marcus braced himself for the renovation's final, unrecoverable setback. Instead, Carlos simply rolled up his sleeves, called in 2 favors from old co-workers, and had the floor reframed within 4 days, refusing every offer of extra payment. "You didn't choose the floor over your kid," Carlos told him. "That's the only math that ever mattered here." Money remained impossibly tight throughout the renovation. Marcus took a night shift stocking shelves at a grocery store just to cover basic expenses, while the bakery took shape during the day, running on barely 4 hours of sleep for months at a stretch. There were nights he sat on the unfinished bakery floor after Carlos had gone home, surrounded by half-painted walls, wondering if exhaustion alone might finish what grief and unemployment had started. It was Jenna Park, a young woman who answered his hastily posted help-wanted flyer, who reminded him during one of those low moments that showing up exhausted still counted as showing up. Jenna, a culinary school graduate who had grown disillusioned, working under a chain bakery. Corporate quotas, became Marcus's first employee before the shop had even opened its doors, working for deferred pay because she believed in what he was building. The Larkspur loaf opened on a rainy Tuesday morning in early spring, nearly a year after Marcus had been fired from Sterling & Co. Foods. Only 9 customers came through the door that first day, most of them neighbors who had watched the renovation from their windows for months. Marcus stood behind a counter he had built with his own hands, staring at trays of unsold cinnamon bread as closing time approached, gripped by the same fear that had haunted him since the termination letter, that he had built something beautiful on a foundation of desperation rather than sense. Ruth, sweeping the floor beside him that evening, simply said, "Every good bakery starts exactly like this. The bread doesn't know it's supposed to fail. Neither do you." Word of the small, family-run bakery spread slowly through the neighborhood, aided by Eli's decision to hand out free samples outside the local middle school, with a shy but determined confidence that surprised his father. A parenting blog run by another single father in the community wrote a warm, unpaid post about the dad who rebuilt his life one loaf at a time, and within weeks, weekend lines began forming before the shop even opened. Marcus expanded cautiously, adding a small seating area, then a modest catering menu for birthdays and community events, always careful never to grow faster than his own 2 hands, and Jenna's steady help could manage honestly. Ruth's own health began slowly declining during the bakery's 2nd year, her once steady hands trembling too much some mornings to help behind the counter, the way she once had at her own shop decades earlier. Marcus insisted on driving her to every doctor's appointment himself, refusing her protests that he had a business to run, telling her simply that showing up for the people who had shown up for him was not optional. Ruth spent her afternoons, instead, at a small corner table near the window, sipping tea and greeting regulars by name, still teaching Mia the occasional lesson in frosting technique, with hands that shook only slightly less than her determination. By the bakery's 2nd year, the Larkspur loaf had become a genuine neighborhood institution, its walls covered in children's crayon drawings customers had left behind, its recipe board filled with community suggestions Marcus tried out each month. Eli, now 14, worked the register most Saturdays, having grown into a confident, easy conversationalist, entirely unlike the withdrawn boy who once hid in his room. Mia, 9, had taken to designing the shop's seasonal window displays, her crayon sketches translated faithfully by her father into painted glass. Marcus had not become wealthy by any corporate measure, but for the first time since Claire's death, he recognized the man looking back at him in the bakery's front window each morning. Meanwhile, Sterling & Co. Foods was quietly collapsing under the weight of its own philosophy. The relentless cost-cutting that had discarded Marcus and dozens of other experienced managers had gutted the institutional knowledge holding the company's supply chain together, leading to a catastrophic distribution failure during the busiest shipping season of the year. Board member Eleanor Cross, one of the few voices who had argued against Marcus's termination at the time, watched the fallout unfold with grim vindication as major retail partners severed contracts over repeated late shipments and quality lapses. Jonathan Sterling, once celebrated for his aggressive efficiency, found himself testifying before an increasingly hostile board about decisions that had prioritized short-term numbers over long-term stability. Eleanor Cross had sat 2 seats down from Jonathan the day Marcus's termination was finalized. One of only 2 board members who had quietly questioned whether cutting the distribution division's most experienced manager made sense, purely to satisfy a quarterly projection. She had kept, almost without meaning to, a private mental list of the names quietly pushed out under Jonathan's efficiency mandates. And when the supply chain finally buckled 2 years later, she recognized the pattern immediately for what it was. In the closed-door meeting that ultimately ended Jonathan's tenure, Eleanor did not gloat, but she did, for the first time in years, feel the quiet satisfaction of being right about something that should never have needed proving. The board voted Jonathan Sterling out within the year, citing the very talent exodus and operational fragility his own policies had created. He left the company with a severance package that made headlines for its size and irony, but no amount of money softened the strange, disorienting silence of a calendar with no meetings on it, a phone that no longer rang with urgent calls, an identity built entirely around a title that no longer existed. Jonathan drifted through the months that followed, much the way Marcus once had, applying for board positions and advisory roles that rarely called back, discovering slowly and painfully how much of his confidence had depended on people needing something from him. It was on an unremarkable Thursday morning, nearly 2 years after the firing that had once seemed like the end of Marcus's world, that Jonathan Sterling walked into the Larkspur loaf. He had been driving without any particular destination, the way a person drives when going home no longer feels like relief, and the warm light spilling from the bakery's window against the gray morning drew him inside, almost against his own will. He did not recognize the neighborhood, did not recognize the hand-carved wooden sign, and he certainly did not expect to see Marcus Hale standing behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, flour dusted across his forearms, laughing at something his daughter had said from behind the register. Marcus looked up, and the easy laughter faded from his face as recognition settled in slowly, replaced by something far more complicated than anger. Jonathan stood frozen just inside the doorway, his expensive coat looking suddenly out of place among the mismatched vintage chairs and crayon drawings taped to the walls. "Marcus," he said finally, his voice lacking every trace of the boardroom authority Marcus remembered. "I had no idea this was you. I saw the light." Mia, sensing tension she did not fully understand, quietly slipped behind her father, and Eli, old enough to recognize the name from stories his father had occasionally, carefully shared, went very still behind the register. Marcus set down the bread knife in his hand and studied the man who had once dismissed 9 years' of loyalty in a 15-minute meeting, the man whose signature on a termination letter had, however unintentionally, set in motion everything Marcus had since built. He thought of foreclosure notices and laundromat apartments, of Ruth's warm bread on the back steps, of Eli's slow return to laughter, of Mia's crayon window displays, of every 4 a.m. morning that had turned devastation into something resembling a life again. He felt no triumph, only a tired, hard-won clarity. "Sit down, Jonathan," Marcus said quietly. "You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in a while." Jonathan sat stiffly at a small table near the window, the same table where neighborhood children pressed sticky fingerprints against the glass on Saturday mornings. Jenna brought over a plate of the cinnamon bread that had first put the shop on the neighborhood map, along with black coffee, without needing to be told twice. She had heard enough of Marcus's story, over 2 years of working beside him, to understand exactly who this man was. Jonathan ate slowly, in a silence that stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of conversation, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the polish that once accompanied it. "I told the board that sentiment wasn't a strategy," he said. "I built an entire career on that line. And I lost the company because I never understood what it actually meant." Marcus did not offer forgiveness in that first conversation, because forgiveness, like a proper loaf of bread, cannot be rushed without collapsing under its own weight. But he offered something closer to honesty than Jonathan had received from anyone in years. "You didn't just fire an employee that day," Marcus told him, sitting across the small table. You fired a father who had nothing left standing except his job. And you did it in 15 minutes without once asking what that would cost my kids. I'm not going to pretend that didn't nearly break us. But I'm also not going to pretend I'd trade what we built because of it. That's not forgiveness, Jonathan. That's just the truth. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing words that no shareholder report had ever demanded he confront. In the months that followed, Jonathan returned to the bakery most Thursday mornings, first as a quiet customer nursing a single coffee near the window, then gradually as something resembling a fixture in the shop's rhythm, though never once stepping behind the counter Marcus had built with his own hands. He asked Eli, hesitantly at first, what it had been like helping rebuild something from nothing at 12 years old, and listened, really listened, to an answer that would have meant nothing to him 2 years earlier. He eventually took a modest advisory role with a nonprofit supporting laid-off manufacturing and logistics workers, a decision he described in a rare interview, not as redemption, but as the first job he had taken specifically because it required him to actually see the people he was meant to help. Marcus never forgot the 15-minute meeting that had once felt like the end of everything, but he stopped letting it define the shape of his anger, somewhere around the time Eli asked, unprompted, whether Mr. Sterling could come to his 8th grade graduation, since he'd sort of become part of the regulars. Marcus said yes, not because the debt between them was settled, but because his children had learned, watching him rebuild a life out of flour and stubbornness, and Ruth's warm bread, that the worst thing that happens to you rarely gets the final word on who you become. Every new employee hired at the Larkspur Loaf hears a shortened version of that story on their first day, not as a lesson in bitterness, but as a lesson in what patient rebuilding can accomplish when everything else has been taken away. If there is one truth this story leaves behind, it is this. Losing your job, your house, even the version of yourself you thought you were supposed to be, does not disqualify you from building something real. Marcus Hale was fired in 15 minutes by a man who measured loyalty in spreadsheets, and he spent the next 2 years proving, one carefully shaped loaf at a time, that a father's worth was never something any company had the power to calculate. Somewhere tonight, someone is sitting exactly where Marcus once sat, wondering how they will rebuild after losing everything that felt permanent. If that is you, let this be your sign. The floor that collapsed beneath you might just be clearing space for the one you are meant to build with your own 2 hands. Years later, when people asked Marcus how he found the courage to buy a boarded-up building with almost nothing left in his name, he never described it as courage at all. He called it the only math that made sense to a man who had already lost the things he could not afford to lose twice. He kept Claire's dinner roll recipe framed, now beside the register, the looping cursive faded but legible, a quiet reminder that some inheritances arrive as recipes rather than money, and that both, in the right hands, can rebuild a life. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it meant something to you, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Drop a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and subscribe for more stories about resilience, second chances, and the quiet strength of starting over from nothing. We will see you in the next one.